"You'll get nothing if you quit today," he snapped, wagging that stupid Mont Blanc pen like it was a wand that could erase the last 8 years of my life. His name was Damon Ridley, Executive Director of Compliance, and he had just dismissed my entire career in one breath while checking his watch mid-sentence like I was a bad date. The office smelled like burnt Nespresso and toner ink. My badge sat on the edge of his desk, still warm from the heat of my palm, and all I could think was, this man has no idea what he just triggered. An hour earlier, I'd pushed our final compliance deployment live, line by line, module by module, everything validated and green. The FCC window was open and ticking. The system I'd built, quietly, alone, with no assistance and zero thank yous, was live. Bulletproof. The kind of deployment that makes or breaks Q1 for a tech company built on selling integrity as a service. But Damon? Damon thought the platform ran itself. Damon thought I was replaceable. Damon thought wrong. Before we go further, do me one quick favor. If you're listening and you're one of the 97% who hasn't subscribed yet, hit that button and give the video a like. It tells the team these stories matter. Okay, back to Damon and the downfall he couldn't see coming. I hadn't always been this cold. Once upon a time, I cared. About the product, about the mission, about making things work so cleanly. Nobody even noticed how complex they were. I was the back-end architect, the compliance whisperer, the woman they called when things were already on fire. I didn't need credit. I needed peace. And for a long time, Alvian gave me just enough of it. But peace gets expensive when men like Damon start sniffing around with buzzwords like restructuring and cost optimization. Translation: they wanted to get rid of people who knew how things actually worked. For 8 years, I made it all work. Vendor transitions, architecture redesigns, zero downtime migrations. I'd even written the automated heartbeat system that pinged compliance modules every hour to simulate live audits. I knew every schema key, every vendor handshake, every dark corner of our regulatory logic. No one else did. Especially not Damon, who spent most of his day in meetings he didn't understand and Slack threads he misquoted. 2 quarters ago, I finished an upgrade that aligned our entire infrastructure with the latest FCC 906 compliance standard, something no other firm in our vertical had done yet. Damon slapped his name on it in a quarterly meeting, presented my work like it was his baby, and got promoted to executive director. I didn't say a word. I just watched him bask in applause for something he couldn't even spell. But that upgrade was only phase 1. The real test was the Q1 renewal. The FCC would scrape our infrastructure logs, review validator performance, compare audit trails. And that validator? Only I had schema access. Only I had the deployment key. Only I knew where the trap doors were, where the whole thing could break if someone too eager tried to streamline things without understanding what they were touching. Last Monday, he started with the small threats. After this push, we're reevaluating roles, he said, tapping his coffee lid like it offended him. Some strategic outsourcing options are on the table. I raised an eyebrow. Are you terminating me? He grinned like a salesman caught mid-lie. No, not unless you quit. Which you won't, because you'd get nothing. That night, I opened my contract for the first time in 2 years. Appendix C, line 83, good leaver clause. It was buried deep, under deferred equity terms and milestone definitions. But it was real, and it was specific. If I resigned voluntarily after the final delivery milestone and submitted the proper documentation, I would receive a severance equal to 6 months base, plus accelerated vesting on my final performance-linked equity block. All I had to do was time it right. Delivery first. Resignation after. The clause wasn't about how you left. It was about when. And Damon? Damon had no idea what I was capable of when I finally decided to walk. He cornered me in the hallway outside the server room. No audience, no HR, just his cologne and that ever-present half-smirk he used when he thought he was being clever. After this push, he said, like we were old colleagues chatting over beers, we're reevaluating roles, realigning with more cost-efficient options. He let the silence sit for a beat too long, like he wanted me to fill it with panic. I didn't blink. Are you terminating me? He laughed. No, not unless you quit, which you won't, because you'd get nothing. And just like that, he laid the bait. I was supposed to spiral, to think I had no leverage, to shut up and keep the lights on while he polished his LinkedIn for his next conference keynote. But instead, I nodded, walked back to my desk, and opened the contract folder I hadn't touched in years. Damon didn't know me well enough to realize that I don't respond to pressure. I study it. And when I find the crack, I wedge it open until the whole damn wall gives way. Appendix C, line 83, buried halfway into a sea of gray font boilerplate and in the event of legalese. A clause I'd forgotten about until his threat jogged my memory. It read like an afterthought, probably added years ago during a round of standardizations, when someone still believed in rewarding strategic departures. But it was airtight. Good leaver clause, activated only when an employee voluntarily resigned after completing a listed milestone, and only if they submitted proof of milestone completion prior to departure. Most people never qualified, because most people never planned. But I had two things on my side: full schema access and calendar control. The next milestone, final deployment of the FCC validator module, and I was the sole architect. No one else had the deployment key. No one else could verify completion logs. No one else could claim authorship. Damon thought the system ran itself. That compliance was a switch you could flick. But he didn't know how many times I'd had to patch his mistakes in silence. How many 2 a.m. bug fixes I logged under his user ID just to avoid a confrontation. How much of his job I'd been doing while he chased golf invites and brand deals. That night, I built a new folder on my personal drive, titled it Exit Path. Inside, I laid out a plan down to the minute, scheduled the deployment, wrote the memo, lined up every time-stamped log. I'd create a digital trail no one could dispute, because if I was walking out that door, I was walking with every penny they owed me. Over the next 2 weeks, I played the role. I smiled in meetings. I took notes on compliance calls. I even helped Damon prep for his quarterly briefing like I hadn't already built the trap he'd fall into. He was too busy preening for execs to notice I'd stopped asking questions, that I'd stopped submitting weekly check-ins, that I was quietly decoupling my name from every shared repository, moving final versions of the validator module into isolated branches only I could access. Meanwhile, HR sent around a company culture pulse survey. Damon bragged about our retention stability in the company Slack, and I kept polishing the system he didn't understand. He thought he had me boxed in, that his threat would keep me tethered just long enough for him to gut my role and offshore the bones. But he hadn't read the contract, and I had, twice. Line 83 didn't care about feelings. It didn't care about HR. It only cared about sequence. Deliver, document, depart. That's all. The timing had to be flawless. A single misstep, a delayed push, a timestamp off by a minute, and I'd lose everything. But I'd spent 8 years mastering the invisible details, and I wasn't about to let Damon's arrogance rob me of a clean escape. He thought I had no options. But the clause said otherwise, and soon, so would I. Thursday morning, 6:32 a.m. sharp. The office was still dark, just the hum of HVAC and the occasional printer waking up. I was the only one in, just me, the system, and the final validator module blinking its way into production. No backup team, no oversight. Just my hands, my code, and 8 years of knowing exactly how this company's skeleton was wired. I watched the logs populate, back-end systems returning clean status reports, encrypted heartbeat signals confirming compliance integrity. The FCC validator hit green across all dashboards. No alerts, no skipped lines. My code ran perfectly, like it always did. I paused for 1 full minute, let the system run through its second internal self-check just for good measure, then pulled up the pre-written resignation letter from the folder I'd titled Exit Path. I printed it, along with the signed milestone completion memo I'd already time-stamped and backed up across 2 secure drives and an encrypted email queue scheduled for HR at 8 a.m. By 7:41 a.m., I was standing outside Damon's office. He had just walked in, latte in one hand, Bluetooth still in his ear from whatever performative call he liked to start the day with. He didn't even glance up. "I'm done," I said, flat and direct. "Resignation effective today. Completion memos attached." He looked up like I'd just told him I was joining the circus. Then he laughed, hard, that wheezing, nasal kind of laugh he usually saved for open bar mixers. "Then you walk with nothing," he said, shaking his head like I was a naive intern who didn't know better. I didn't flinch, just placed the memo and letter on his desk, set my badge and office key next to his half-eaten breakfast bar, and walked out. No rebuttal, no lingering stare, no dramatic monologue. He wasn't worth it. I passed through the quiet cubicles and glass conference rooms that had been my home for almost a decade. Nobody else knew what had just happened. They'd show up in an hour and assume I was just grabbing coffee. They wouldn't realize until much later that I wasn't coming back. Downstairs, I stepped into the cold morning air and finally breathed like the building no longer owned my lungs. It was quiet. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt done, clean, like I'd finally deleted a corrupted file that had been slowing my system down for years. They thought they'd squeezed me out without a penny. No lawsuit, no internal escalation, no messy headlines. Damon probably already had a Slack message drafted to announce my departure. Something vague and saccharine. We thank her for her years of service and wish her the best in her future endeavors. I could practically hear the keyboard clicking, but he hadn't checked the deployment timestamps. He didn't know about line 83. He didn't know the clock had already started, and I wasn't about to tell him. Let him laugh now. Let him pour his oat milk and start his victory lap. By the time they figured it out, I'd be 3 steps ahead. And the clause? Already active, just waiting to be enforced. It didn't even take a full hour. I was sipping coffee at a little spot 2 blocks from the office, sun barely over the skyline, watching people shuffle in half awake, unaware that just a few floors above them, Damon Ridley's morning was starting to implode. At 8:39 a.m., legal pinged him. I know because someone forwarded me the Slack screenshot later. One of those quiet allies who'd seen enough to know Damon's version of the truth was always missing a few footnotes. The message was short, clinical, corporate. Why did you approve her resignation immediately following a validator delivery? That triggers Clause 83. He replied fast. Too fast. I thought she forfeited by resigning. The next response hit like a hammer. Not if milestone delivery is timestamped prior to resignation. Which it is. 0632 UTC. Validator schema confirmed complete. Her resignation was logged at 07.41. That activates good leaver status. Full severance and equity payout now legally due. I imagine the color left his face in real time. 1 minute, he's prepping his morning brag notes for the executive sync, probably practicing how to spin my departure as a proactive org refresh. Next minute, legal's telling him he just personally approved a 6-figure clause he didn't even know existed. That's the thing with people like Damon. They assume everyone else is stupid. They skim contracts. They cut corners. They think loyalty is just another word for fear. He thought I'd walk out with nothing because that's what he would have done. Loud, petty, emotional, burning bridges on the way out. But I hadn't yelled. I hadn't even flinched. I'd just signed, turned, and left the grenade ticking quietly under his desk. Somewhere around 9:15, I got the first email from HR. Subject line, clarification request, Appendix C provisions. They wanted to confirm my resignation timing. I didn't reply. They already had the memo, the logs, the push ID, and the validator timestamps. All filed, all synced, all backed up on their own internal portal. The moment I submitted, the clock had started. Damon probably tried to bluff his way through it, talk circles around the clause, deflect responsibility, maybe try to pin it on me for manipulating language. But clauses don't care about narratives. They care about sequence. And the sequence was locked. The validator went live at 0632. I resigned at 0741. The clause kicked in the moment that memo hit the record. Everything after that was noise. By noon, he was in full scramble mode, trying to call in favors from legal, whispering to the CFO, probably begging HR to find ambiguity in the language. But there wasn't any. It was clean. They'd left it in the contract years ago because no one thought someone like me would ever use it. And now, they were staring down the cost of forgetting their own fine print. He had signed off on it. With that same damn pen he twirled like a trophy. That same pen I'd watched him use to dismiss my career like it was a calendar event. Well, now the pen had bit back, and this time, it had a clause. A very expensive clause. At 10:07 a.m., my phone lit up with Damon's name. I let it ring. Twice, then a third time. By the fourth, I picked up, not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted to listen. And God, did he come in hot with the fake charm. Hey, he said, stretching the word like we were old pals grabbing lunch, not 2 people on opposite ends of a legal tripwire he just set off. So, listen. There might have been a slight miscommunication this morning. Totally on me. I should have given you a little more context. Context. That's what he was calling it now. He cleared his throat. What if, instead of finalizing everything today, we restructure the exit, give it a little breathing room? Maybe delay formal acceptance by a day, just so legal has time to iron out the language. I'm sure you don't want this to get messy. There it was. The casual threat wrapped in HR-flavored frosting. I didn't respond right away. Just let the static sit between us until I could hear the shallow panic behind his calm. Then I said, "It's already finalized." He stammered. "Well, I mean, nothing's technically finalized until..." The resignation was time-stamped. The memo submitted. Email logs confirm milestone delivery at 0632. I've already submitted to HR in the board compliance portal. Clause 83 is active. Silence. I could picture him staring at his screen, scrolling through old PDFs he never read, trying to find some clause, some asterisk, some clause in a clause that could give him a way out. But there wasn't one. Because while Damon was busy schmoozing execs and posting about leadership in tech on LinkedIn, I was busy building a resignation that even their best legal team couldn't unwind. Every log was pre-scheduled, every email preloaded with UTC timestamps. The project delivery memo, digitally signed and stored in 3 places. I'd made it so the moment that validator went green, the entire structure of my departure locked into place like a vault. No room for edits. No wiggle room, no whiteboard strategy session that could undo it. He tried one last Hail Mary. "I'm sure there's a way we can both get what we want here, if you just hold off a day." "I don't want anything, Damon. I earned it, and I followed the contract you signed." I hung up before he could respond. Not out of spite, just clarity. There was nothing left to say. After that, legal made a few more desperate moves. I got a request to confirm intent to depart in a form labeled draft, not binding. Cute. HR sent a revised transition form with a blank signature line and a note about updated terms for consideration. I ignored them all. They weren't dealing with someone flying off the handle. I wasn't slamming doors or storming out. That's what they were hoping for, some angry outburst they could reframe as emotional misconduct or abandonment of post. But there was nothing emotional about what I did. It was math, code, sequence. I wasn't a disgruntled employee. I wasn't even mad. I was a vested good leaver with every log, every timestamp, every clause sitting exactly where it needed to be. And they were scrambling because for the first time in a very long time, they weren't in control. By mid-afternoon, the calls stopped and the emails went suspiciously quiet. That's when I knew they'd found it. Clause 83 wasn't just a severance clause. That was the appetizer. The real knife buried in that contract was 2 pages down, section 4.5b, under a section titled Post-Milestone Incentive Accruals. Legalese for, if this person completes a qualifying milestone and exits cleanly, they get everything that vests over the following 48-hour audit window, automatically. And guess what had just begun ticking the moment my schema deployment hit the system at 0632 a.m. That audit window, they thought they were dodging a severance package. Instead, they'd activated an equity nuke. It was the kind of clause companies forget exists until someone smart and quiet follows the instructions to the letter. And I had. I'd reviewed that section 10 times the night before, highlighting every contingency, every phrase that could be twisted, and baking it into my exit plan with forensic precision. Here's why it mattered. That 48-hour window was tied to system performance. If the validator maintained full compliance across all data streams without a single breach or code rollback, the system was considered exemplary, and my final equity tranche vested early. All of it. Normally, that tranche would have taken 2 more years to vest gradually, but they'd baked in an exceptional exit acceleration trigger as a retention lure for senior architects like me, back when they were trying to keep top talent. It was hidden behind milestones they assumed no one would deliver right before walking out the door. It was insurance. But I'd cashed it in. The numbers? $220,000 in base severance, but the equity, $900,000, vesting over 48 hours starting from the moment my final deployment hit the system. And they couldn't stop it, not unless the system failed, which it wouldn't. because I'd built it not just to perform, but to hum like a goddamn Rolex during that exact window. Every backup script, every ping, every error capture loop, all reinforced, redundant, fortified. If someone on their end tried to optimize it during those 48 hours to create a fail point, that would be logged too and invalidate their own infrastructure audit. A self-own baked into compliance. So now they were stuck watching a countdown. They couldn't pause, like a bomb they had wired themselves and handed to me with a smirk. I picture Damon sitting in that glass office, sweating into his ergonomic chair, staring at the audit dashboard as every green check mark that appeared cost him more face, more money, more power. Because here's the kicker, he signed off on every system I wrote, which meant every performance milestone tied to that audit had his signature on the underlying logic. He'd vouched for it in 3 board meetings, quoted it in 2 press briefings, and now, as that window ticked down and the system stayed flawless, he was watching my payout grow in real time, on a dashboard he'd once used to steal my credit. Now, every green tick was a receipt. They couldn't revoke my resignation. They couldn't block the audit. They couldn't unsign the clause. All they could do was sit there and hope for a failure that wasn't coming. I imagined the silence in that legal conference room when the final numbers clicked into place, when the general counsel realized what $1.12 million in total liability looked like on a clause they'd all signed and filed away, thinking no one would ever use it. Well, someone did. Me. Because they forgot something critical when they built that clause. I read contracts. I write systems. And I don't bluff. At 7:08 the next morning, I sent one email. No legalese, no fluff, just precision. To whom it may concern, I am confirming that all resignation conditions under Appendix C, Clause 83 have been met as of timestamp EO6.3214 UTC. Please find logs, push confirmation, and completion memo attached. Attached were everything they'd need to see the writing on the wall. System audit logs with exact deployment times, hash match to the production environment, the digitally signed completion memo with a UTC timestamp, and a PDF of the resignation letter timestamped and acknowledged by HR via their internal portal. I even included a checksum verification string, just to remove any doubt that the files were untouched. They didn't respond. No out-of-office reply. No generic acknowledgement. Just corporate silence, the kind that hums like fluorescent lighting over a crime scene. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Same area code, this time marked Alvion switchboard. I picked up. "Hi," a woman's voice said, calm but overly rehearsed. "This is Claire Nichols from Executive Affairs. I was wondering if you'd be open to having a conversation, off record, of course, about resolving your departure amicably." Translation. Legal was now in full scramble mode, and someone much higher up than Damon had been handed the file and told, "Fix this before it goes nuclear." I didn't say anything right away. Just let the silence hang. She cleared her throat. "We're hoping to avoid unnecessary tension. Would you be open to... Oh, that depends," I said finally. "Is legal still pretending I don't read contracts?" She hesitated. Not long. But just enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "No," she said softly. "They're not." It was the first honest thing anyone from that building had said to me in weeks. I could hear the shift in her voice, the kind of careful neutrality reserved for when someone on the other side is holding a live grenade and everyone knows it's ticking. She offered a few vague reassurances. That the company valued my contributions, that this wasn't a reflection of my work, that they'd like to find a resolution that acknowledges mutual respect. I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how hard they were trying to dress this up in polite language after weeks of gaslighting, stonewalling, and strategic condescension. Now that the money was real, now that the clause was undeniable, they wanted respect. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just asked one thing. Has the system failed in the audit window? A pause. No. It's actually the compliance metrics are exceeding benchmark. Of course they were. I'll have my counsel respond to any further outreach, I said. But yes, I'm open to resolution. I ended the call and set the phone down. No threats, no ultimatums, just facts, stacked and signed, sitting on their own infrastructure, growing more expensive by the hour. The power had shifted. Damon was no longer in the conversation. His name wasn't even in the CC line anymore. Now, they weren't managing me. They were managing Fallout. 2 weeks after I walked out of Alvian Technologies with my systems humming and their legal team spiraling, I stepped through the glass doors of Civentix HQ with a new badge, a better title, and no one doubting whether I belonged there. Senior Systems Architect. No fluff, no politics, no Damon. Civentix had been eyeing me for months. Quiet feelers through recruiters, just coffee chats with department heads, NDA design reviews under the guise of consulting feedback. But once news of my clean exit hit the rumor mill, especially the part where I walked with 7 figures while Alvian's back end stayed flawless, they didn't hesitate. Offer letter in 24 hours, signed in 12. Their onboarding packet had a note at the bottom. We don't miss the details either. And that was that. 3 weeks later, they asked me to sit in on a regional compliance workshop. Nothing huge. Just a strategy roundtable with vendor partners and competitors who serviced similar verticals. Insurance, logistics, medtech. Boring to most, but exactly where I lived. Diagrams, failovers, clauses. My idea of church. I said yes. The venue was a glass-walled conference suite in a high-rise downtown, catered by people who couldn't pronounce half the ingredients on the charcuterie board. I walked in wearing a soft gray blazer and a badge that simply read, A. Miles, Civentix, Systems Lead. I took a seat at the long table near the middle, flipped open the packet, and glanced at the agenda. Session 3, Contractual Exposure in Post-Exit Audit Windows. My pulse didn't move, but I smirked. 15 minutes later, the panel began, and 2 of the late arrivals slid into seats at the head of the table. Alvian's CIO, Meredith Finch, and right next to her, Damon Ridley, looking like he'd swallowed a battery. His eyes swept the table once, twice, then locked on me. I didn't blink, just nodded slightly, like he was a name I barely remembered. The host, a lawyer with the kind of stage voice that makes NDAs sound thrilling, kicked off with a slide titled Case Study, Clause 83, A Real-World Breakdown. Damon stiffened. The host didn't name names, but they didn't have to. They walked through the timeline, anonymous of course, of a senior architect who pushed a regulatory milestone, resigned an hour later, and walked away with 7 figures because the company didn't understand their own contract language, because they didn't read the conditions they signed, because they underestimated the quiet person in the room. I sat still, took a slow sip of coffee, flipped a page. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Damon fidget, scratch at his collar, shift in his seat like the cushion had turned to fire. The host went on. This clause, though boilerplate in many contracts drafted prior to 2020, represents a significant risk, particularly when tied to post-delivery performance metrics. Once activated, it is nearly impossible to unwind without evidence of misconduct. Meredith looked down at her notes, jaw locked. Damon looked like he wanted to vanish into his chair. The host clicked again. And in this particular case, the employee followed every instruction, documented everything, logged timestamps across multiple platforms, submitted through the board's compliance portal. There was no gray area, just precision. Legal didn't catch it until it was too late. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I just let the silence do what it always does. At the end of the session, the host asked for questions. No one spoke. And Damon never looked in my direction again. He didn't need to. His mistake was already up on the screen. And I had become the cautionary tale that made every exec in the room start flipping through their own contracts, wondering what quiet time bomb they'd missed. 3 months passed like clockwork. No press release, no internal memo. Just a quiet update to Alvian's executive contract templates. Clause 83 gone, stripped clean from every new hire packet, as if it had never existed. Like they thought deleting the language would erase the memory of what happened. But the industry remembered. And so did I. The severance hit my account without ceremony. No groveling emails, no further amicable resolution calls. Just a final deposit with a vague line item labeled Departure Settlement. HR never said a word. Legal didn't follow up. They knew better. The equity vesting followed 2 days later. $900,000, clean and indisputable. Audit window passed. System flawless. Trigger conditions met. My terms, not theirs. I didn't frame the check. I didn't celebrate. I just transferred it, reallocated it, and filed the tax paperwork under a new LLC I'd quietly formed during my second week at Saventix. Damon had once asked what I'd do if I ever left. Probably sleep, I'd joked. Turns out I slept just fine, especially knowing the $17 million federal contract they'd been banking on now belonged to us. That's right. The bid they thought was in the bag, the one they used to tout in investor decks and compliance roadmaps, it came up for renewal. And this time, Alvian wasn't even in the final round. Saventix was. And I was listed by name as the systems architect responsible for the proposal's compliance backbone, the same architecture Damon once called redundant and overcomplicated. We submitted the proposal on a Thursday, got confirmation on Monday, and 2 weeks later the award was ours. I didn't post about it, didn't gloat on LinkedIn, didn't update my headline to say federal bid winner or drop coy hashtags about winning with integrity. Instead, I kept my head down and did the same thing I'd done for 8 years. Made things work behind the scenes. Quiet, clean, bulletproof. The difference? This time, no one was stealing credit. No one was pretending they'd written the rules. No one was talking over me in meetings, smiling while they dismantled my job in the background. Because this time, they knew exactly what I was capable of. I never yelled, never threatened, just signed, and let their arrogance walk itself into a clause they forgot existed until it cost them $1 million, a federal contract, and every shred of plausible deniability they ever had. That's the thing about fine print. It's not about tricking people. It's about being the only one in the room who reads it.